Acts 3, 1 through 10. One day Peter and John were going up to the temple at the time of prayer at 3 in the afternoon. Now a man crippled from birth was being carried to the temple gate called Beautiful, where he was put every day to beg from those who were going into the temple courts. When he saw Peter and John about to enter, he asked them for money. Peter looked straight at him, as did John, and then Peter said, "Look at us." So the man gave them his attention, expecting to get something from them. Then Peter said, "Silver or gold I do not have, but what I have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." Taking him by the right hand, he helped him up, and instantly the man's feet and ankles became strong. He jumped to his feet and began to walk. Then he went with them into the temple courts, walking and jumping and praising God. When all the people saw him walking and praising God, they recognized him as the same man who used to sit begging at the temple gate called Beautiful, and they were filled with wonder and amazement at what had happened to him.
Many of us struggle to know what to do with stories like today's, don't we? These healing stories can be tough. Maybe you or a loved one has prayed for healing, but it never came. Maybe you've been told that your disability or your loved one's disability would already have been healed if you just prayed with enough faith. Or maybe you followed the stories of those who've let their children die of treatable diseases because they saw illness as a test of faith. Or maybe you've observed the church focusing on a prosperity gospel that peddles miracle healings that are out of this world, leaving it no time to work for the social justice that could be possible if enough people just cared about it right here in this world. If any of that applies to you, especially that last one, I wouldn't blame you if you saw today's story as not just complicated, but as begging the question, Pastor Peter, it's the week of the Derek Chauvin verdict, and you want to preach to us about miracle healings? Well, I do. You know, as much trouble as these stories give some of us, there's a pretty valid argument that healing was what Jesus was most known for in his time. Growing up in the church, I've always found healing stories to be the most difficult part of the Gospels to trust, sometimes even more difficult than the resurrection itself. But I was stunned when, while learning about the work of those who have sought to find the historical Jesus, I discovered that Jesus' reputation as a healer might be the one thing they find the most trustworthy in the Gospels. That these historians, some of them deeply skeptical about the Gospels, tend to agree on one thing. That if there is something we can trust is true in the Gospels, it is that this person named Jesus most definitely was known for healing people. Now, of course, this doesn't mean they're not skeptical about what those healings really entail, but the point is that there's really no getting around the fact that Jesus's healing stories are so frequent, so embedded in the Gospels, so corroborated by other writers from his time, even writers who didn't like Jesus or his followers, that one of the many things that one of the things that many of us are the most skeptical about today actually turns out to be one of the things that has been the most verified by historians, that the healing stories are based on something that Jesus was really doing a lot of. So then here we are in the third chapter of Acts, right after the story of Pentecost, right after the church has started. And what's the first thing this new church does? Peter and John go out, see a man who needs healing, and heal him. Jesus did it time and again, and here it is. As soon as the church gets started, they start doing it too, right off the bat. But actually, I don't choose to preach about healing stories. I didn't just choose a healing story for today because they're so common in the Bible. I chose this healing story because I think these stories truly have something for us. And more than that, I think that all too often we miss it. Because I think, for starters, that we might be fixating on the wrong thing in these stories. Fixation tied to our time and place. And I think that there's something for us in these stories that is much bigger than what we fixate on. Something that introduces us to a more holistic perspective on healing. Something that can take our skepticism and race beyond it with an opportunity for healing for us as a church family. Something that can even be what we need to hear in the midst of this broken world. In the midst of this broken world, even on the week of the Derek Chauvin verdict, with everything that case demands from us as it rightfully grips our attention. To begin, let's do something we don't do nearly often enough in church. Let's hear what someone who has lived life with a disability actually has to say about faith and healing. Let's hear the testimony of Elizabeth Stazak as she told it to Professor Bethany McKinney Fox, the author of the book, Disability and the Way of Jesus, Holistic Healing in the Gospels and in the Church. As a contribution to that book, Elizabeth wrote this. Growing up with cerebral palsy, it never really occurred to me that God might heal my body in this world. People prayed for healing for me in situational contexts, like when I would have a surgery. Praying for healing seemed appropriate in those situations. Then, as a late teen, I was introduced to charismatic Christianity when I went to visit a friend at her internship. We went to a weekend church that included a portion in which the musicians instructed those who wanted healing to ask for such a thing. Asking God for my own healing seemed not only audacious, but also impossible. The possibility of being healed from the brain damage of cerebral palsy in that moment and walking out of the room forever changed seemed ridiculous. I felt unsure that God wanted to heal me of cerebral palsy. After all, it hadn't happened so far. Regardless of my feelings, I stepped forward to take a chance, and people prayed for me. After standing a long time singing worship music, my familiar leg spasms started occurring, and I took my friend's hand and I put it on my leg so she could feel the shaking. She whispered in my ear, "Are you being healed?" I replied, sadly, "No, my leg is just spazzing." My friend was sympathetic, and we continued to sing and pray anyway. It was an anticlimactic experience which confirmed my suspicion that God likely did not want to heal me that day, or maybe at all. Some Christians might think that my faith was not enough that day at the service. Others might think healing could still happen in my lifetime. Either option or both are possibilities. However, during that time and now over 10 years later, God has chosen to heal me with a variety of tools. My cerebral palsy hasn't gone away, but God has healed me using modern medicine, relationships, and yes, prayer. Healing has many definitions for me beyond dichotomies of healing in my soul or a complete physical healing from cerebral palsy. I have healed each time I was stitched up. I have healed in my sleep, awaking with the blessing of the absence of pain for a time. I have healed through the conversations and laughs shared with my physical therapist. I have healed shedding tears for my circumstances, and hugs have healed the ache of my heart for decades. I have experienced healing by the words of the Jesus prayer, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." I have healed by putting the needs of others before my own, and I have healed while lamenting with friends about our suffering and through the actions of empathy. Most of all, I am the recipient of the ultimate healing that Christ has conquered death and offered me communion with God forevermore. The testimony of Elizabeth Stazak, thanks be to God. Friends, what do you notice in Elizabeth's testimony? Do you, for starters, notice that Elizabeth has in some ways a more expansive understanding of healing than most of us tend to? That she thinks of healing in ways that we often don't, in our binary understanding of either fully healed from an ailment or disability or not fully healed from an ailment or disability. You know, there's a reason for our narrow focus. In that book, Disability and the Way of Jesus, Professor McKinney Fox reminds us that as Westerners, we almost exclusively associate the word healing with biomedical healing. That is, when we in our time and place hear the words Jesus and healer, we picture Dr. Jesus, basically the same as our family physician, whose job is to perform the kind of healings our family doctor would, just in his case, like miraculously and better. Which is to say, when we read a healing story, we zone in on the physical condition of the person being healed, and all we really see is that in the story. But what if there's more happening here and we're just missing it? What if our Western perspective has actually put blinders on us and there's more to see out there? What if, say, we could look at these stories more similarly to how a first century Mediterranean Jew might see them? What might we notice then? Well, in her book, Professor McKinney Fox gives us the opportunity to do just that. And she does so by pointing out that the writers of the gospel and their original audience would have seen something much, much bigger happening in these stories. What was that? Well, for those writing and first reading the Gospels, Jesus had shown up in the middle of a long story that they knew themselves to be living in. It was a story that included God's promise that someone would come to them to do something new and big for them, that someone would come to begin a whole new age for them, to start what they called a new kingdom for them. And in that story, the person who would come would have God's Spirit on them. And according to the prophets, they would know that that person had God's Spirit on them because that person would bring healing to people. Those healings would be a sign that God's sent one had come. And with that, God's sent one would be signaling that God's new era, God's new community had begun. So if you were a first century Mediterranean Jew hearing or writing or reading about Jesus' healings, this is what you were thinking about. Not just little old Dr. Jesus, but something much bigger. You were thinking about Messiah Jesus, the one whose life was a sign that God had not abandoned you, or that project God said God was working on for you was still happening. You were thinking about Messiah Jesus as a sign that not only was God still with you, but that God was finally beginning that new age, beginning that kingdom, starting that community. Except here's the thing, kind of a big hitch for many, actually. When Jesus arrives and the healing he does begins to prove that he is that promised Messiah, which begins to establish that there is this new kingdom forming, Jesus heals the wrong people. Or Jesus heals them in the wrong ways or at the wrong times. Just generally speaking, Jesus' healings undermine the whole system of who gets to control who is in and who is out of God's people. I mean, do you notice something that keeps happening after Jesus' healings? If you've read today's story before, do you remember what happens right after this healing? The person Jesus heals is restored to their religious community, and many of the authorities can't stand it. The authorities accuse Peter and John of being flat out evil. Jesus got that treatment too. And as we've seen in other recent stories we've read together, Jesus was often also attacked for things like healing on the wrong day of the week. Whatever it was, behind all of it consistently seems to be this. In his healings, Jesus, time and again, does things that restore people back to having status, back to the status that is welcome to have full participation in their religious community. But this is critical, so listen for this part. Jesus doesn't just restore an individual or two into their community. Jesus' healings, Jesus' arguments with the religious rulers, Jesus' entire life and teachings, Jesus' death and resurrection, they all show that Jesus is not just restoring a few lucky individuals into their community. Jesus is challenging the actual boundaries of the whole community. And Jesus is bursting them wide open. Of course, we tend to miss this. We miss this because we tend to read these stories with 21st century Western eyes, which fixate on the biomedical healing part, and then only even half notice that the healings continuously restore the healed person to their community. And then on top of that, we only half notice or even read almost as entirely separate stories, the part where Jesus keeps proving to be challenging the whole system of religious and community gatekeeping. But in doing that, in reading with our 21st century Western tunnel vision, we miss this, that the Gospels use Jesus's healings to assert that Jesus was proving how he was the one sent by God, and that in a brilliantly subversive move, Jesus used those very healings that prove he is establishing God's awaited kingdom to also blow the gates of that kingdom wide open, wider than anyone was expecting, so wide that it could be more like a kingdom that also welcomes those who were assumed to be rejected. So what can all this offer to us as a church family? Well, here's what's been on my heart. When it comes to healing, those of us whose need for healing is less obvious, which often means less physical or biomedical, We tend to notice others' ailments or disabilities and think, wouldn't it be nice if God healed them? But then, because we only associate healing with biomedical healing, we get nervous that God won't do it. So we often end up just keeping our distance because truly we find the whole thing to be a challenge to our faith. But if we see the New Testament's healing stories without those blinders on, if we ourselves let Jesus heal us from having had those blinders put on us, if we let Jesus show us how to see without them, there is this. And I think of it kind of like a question. What might it look like for us to first and foremost concern ourselves not with our doubts about the biomedical healing aspects of these stories, but with the much, much bigger thing that the Gospels and the book of Acts are using these stories to show us? That we are the inheritors of a kingdom with its walls and its gates blown wide open. And if we are, then the question becomes, how well are we listening to those among us who may be feeling left on the margins because of their physical, mental, or intellectual ailments or disabilities? Are we hearing from them what they are really looking for in order for us to be the community that Jesus created us to be? And then, what are we doing about what we've heard in order to heal ourselves from that? From anything that leaves some feeling less noticed, less cared for, less included than others? That's my challenge for all of us today. And I will say, I think there are ways in which we already do some of this very well. And there are ways in which, of course, I think we probably still need healing. It takes intentionality and time. But I think we have places where we started on this and more room to heal. So I invite you to join me in looking for both, which is really to join Jesus in his healing work among us. Thanks be to God. But this week, one more thing. In the wake of the Derek Chauvin verdict, one more thing. Friends, allow me to also observe this. I know that many of us celebrated the accountability and justice that Tuesday's verdict represented for us, and I would say it was with good reason. But I know that for me, it's so tempting to see that verdict and then to say, well, good, the problem's finally been solved. I can just go about my business again. But today's story reminds me that doing that is like reading one story of Jesus or the disciples healing one person and then not going on to read the rest of the story. The part where Jesus challenges the whole system that oppressed that person in the first place. Now, I know that that leads to challenging, sometimes even really uncomfortable questions, but today I do feel convicted to add. In addition to asking ourselves about how we can be healed in our relationships across different levels of physical, mental, and intellectual health and ability, let's also continue to ask this. As we reflect on the verdict of this week, the events that led to it, and then as we've just heard, the continued killings of Black Americans, let us also ask, how might we be a part of what Jesus wants to do in this world? Not just for a few individuals who've been killed, hurt, or forced to the margins, but for this entire nation, every single community within it, so that all of us may heal from a system that leaves some of us feeling protected at the cost of making others feel terrifyingly vulnerable. It's hard work for me at least, but friends, I'm honored to be able to do this work and improve at this work with you, to join you in the work of trying to allow ourselves to be fully healed by none other than our good and generous and faithful healer, Jesus Christ.